This evening, we have a great opportunity to speak with the four individuals receiving governor's awards this year. At this pivotal time in our democracy, I consider it a great honor to hear from John Burgess, Sonia Nieto, Heather Cox Richardson, and Annette Gordon-reed, people whose work has shaped the way we understand Massachusetts and our country. At Mass Humanities, we believe that the humanities should be central in decision-making, whether that's personal or public, from the street corner to the classroom to the state house. As a parent, I think a lot about the experiences my young children are having right now, about the information they receive about their town or our democracy or their education. And I know that what they do today is going to impact the way that they understand the world going forward. So to start things off this evening, I thought that we would begin at the beginning with some of the early experiences and sparks of humanities engagement that set our awardees off on the careers that they have enjoyed. And I'm going to start with you. In your new book, Juneteenth, you describe your parents' decision to send you to an all-white elementary school. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that shaped your understanding of history and the world around you.
Well, it was a pivotal influence, I think. My parents were idealistic people. They thought that they were making a step for racial equality. And I knew, even at 6, that this was a momentous thing. I talk about the fact that a relative went out to one of the most expensive stores in Houston, the big department there, Sakowitz, and bought a bunch of clothes for me. And I had clothes, but she really, really wanted me to be dressed well when I went. This was her contribution to the civil rights movement. So that whole question of why it was a big deal that I was going to a white school, that I was integrating our town school, came home to me very, very early on. And I wondered about, why is this a big deal? Why is this something that's momentous? How did we get to a place where this was something that everybody was focusing on? And so that really did make me think about our past. It made me think about race, the question of race, and the role that it played in my hometown, where when I was a kid, when we went to the movies, Black people sat in the balcony. And when I went to the doctor's office, there was a separate waiting room, a separate and unequal waiting room for us. All of those things, those experiences made me think about the present and how the past had brought us to that particular point. So I would say going to that school, having that experience was absolutely essential to my setting me on the road to thinking about history and the question of race in the United States.
Sonia, you've done groundbreaking work as a scholar around children's books. I'm interested in your case, what were the books you were reading early on and how that widened your understanding of the larger world?
Thanks for the question, Brian. I unlike Annette, I went to a school in a poor neighborhood, and with almost all immigrant students. And when I started school, I spoke only Spanish. So of course that was a huge influence in my life. I wasn't reading yet. I wasn't one of those kids who went to school knowing how to read. I missed kindergarten. So I went into first grade, but I think I learned to read pretty quickly. And of course that changed my life. But you know what, I don't think I could have put it into words at that point, but it was clear to me that the kids who I saw in the books that we were reading, which were basal readers for the most part, didn't lead lives like we did. And so in terms of what they looked like, I mean, my family was pretty light-skinned, so we could all have fit in probably, but they didn't speak Spanish. They didn't eat the foods that we ate. They didn't have the same experiences. And yet I pivoted towards books from a very early age. And there are things that really resonated with me, even though they were books about other experiences. For example, I loved the book Heidi. Now, why would I love that book? I didn't have a grandfather. I didn't have any grandparents that I ever met. I didn't live in Switzerland or wherever it takes place. I didn't live in a loft, but I read all the time like Heidi did. And we had very strong relationships in my family. And so I guess I could really connect with that. And in the same way I connected with Little Women, you know, our lives were so different, and yet I was Jo. I was really Jo. I was the girl who read all the time. So, you know, this taught me later on that it's really, really important to have books for all kids that they can connect with because of their own backgrounds, their languages, their identities, their families, their histories. And at the same time, it's really important that they have books that expand their perspectives and their vision. And so I had those. I didn't have the first, you know, but I had those that really expanded my perspective and my vision about who I was. And it was only later, much later. I mean, I never read a book by a Puerto Rican until I was in college. I never had a Puerto Rican teacher. And so all of that really influenced me, I think, to not only become a teacher, but to do research on Puerto Rican children's literature and why it was so important for me and for my kids and my students as well, to have a broader vision by having themselves in the picture, because otherwise they were out of the picture.
I think this idea of the family classroom is really, really important, but also these narratives that are submerged or not opened up to you until you really go out there into the world. John, there's a great article on our website, masshumanities.org, where you talk about growing up in a family where your parents really hadn't had a lot of educational opportunities. Can you talk about the conversations you had with them? Because they do seem to be, though, very interested in the outside world and in politics and in current events.
I'd be happy to, and it ties in with the comments that were made just before about the role of the family and the path of my mother and father. They were both coming out of the Depression, so my mother never finished high school. My father ultimately became a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health, but only because the U.S. Navy put him through college during the Second World War. So different paths. And with my mother, it, I think, was a real challenge in the 1950s for her. She hadn't graduated high school. She was very interested in history and global affairs. When I look back at it, I think her life was somewhat isolated. And as a result, she simply treated us children as people to talk about these matters with. I still remember her telling me when I was 6 or 7, I can't remember, that Hugh Gateskill, who was a Labour politician in the UK, had died, and he'd been a really great man. And I was like, at the time, okay, whatever. But I realized in retrospect, my mother was following Labour politics, you know, in Wakefield. And evidently she had really no one to talk to about it than her son and daughter. But that was fine, because it really gave a chance, I think, for me early to understand that that was part of what one should be interested in. And there were really no limits on what you should be interested in. And encouraging me to read, there was a history series called Landmark Books, which she would bring lots of back. I'm sure if I saw one now, I'd decide it was like completely wrong in lots of directions, but it didn't matter. It was a set of narratives that really got me interested. For my father, the path was a little different because he was able to go first to Tufts and then to Harvard. But in his case, I think that it was really a commitment to any kind of knowledge. He really was, in addition to being a scientist, interested in the blues, which again was not something terribly big in suburban Wakefield in the 1950s, and played blues harmonica and exposed me to a whole set of things which were very different. So that family background, as said earlier, really made a huge difference. And for me, the lesson of how much it was important to them was one I carried with me throughout the rest of my life.
The blues are such a gateway I feel like, to understanding America, actually, particularly if you're not growing up in the places from which it emerged. So that's super interesting to me.
It took me a long time to figure that out, but I eventually fell to it. Yes, absolutely.
John, I collect those landmark books if you ever want some of them.
Oh, you do?
I do. And they're better than you think they are.
That's great. You know,
they're not, they are what they are, but they still exist and you can still get them. And I will add, very cheaply, because not everybody wants those landmark books.
Well, that's great to hear, because I really do think they, for a lot of kids of a certain age, were a gateway to history. They were on
weird things. I mean, it wasn't sort of like the normal thing you got in classes that were, presidents or whatever. It was like the Erie Canal or something. And you'd be like, wait, I've never heard of the Erie Canal. And it was kind of a different way into our history.
Yeah. One of the virtues, I think. Yeah.
Well, Heather, so much of your work over the last year and a half has really been to connect people with the past and to show why the context of history is important in understanding the events that have been unfolding over the last couple of years. For you, what was that spark that really allowed you to see, perhaps at a young age, that there was an importance to knowing the past, whether it's in the landmark books or not, and that it would help you as a person, navigating your way through life?
Well, it is interesting that all four of us, I think, are talking about the exact same themes. I grew up in a very small town in the countryside, and we were quite isolated, not only from other people, but from media, really. I still don't watch TV because we had 3 channels and you saw them through a snowstorm. So generally you didn't bother to watch that much TV except like Gilligan's Island, right? So I didn't have a lot of reach outwardly in my day-to-day life. But what happened in our town was we were surrounded by storytellers, and they were phenomenal storytellers. People sometimes talk about me being a storyteller, and I am quite honest when I say if you had, 12 of these, generally they were older men, but there were women as well in a room, I wouldn't even be on the 12 to be able to speak. I mean, the stories they told and the humor and the way they connected things. But what was really interesting in terms of what that did for me is that the stories were all different. I mean, they told the same stories, but they had different actors, they had different meanings, they had different villains, they had different heroes. And my mother was very into history as well, and into sort of the world history. She had been a WAC in World War II, and part of her job had been to instruct the recruits on what was actually happening in the world. So Mother would say, think about what he's saying, if I repeated one of the stories, think about what's really going on here. There's a long history back there between those families, or there's a long history about what happened on that island. And it made me recognize, first of all, that people had different perspectives on the past, but then the obvious place that an isolated kid goes, even with wonderful friends, but friends that were living quite a distance away, is to books. And like everybody else here, books opened up huge worlds to me, and I devoured Heidi and Little Women and everything I could get my hands on. My grandmother's books from the, flapper books from the 1920s. And all of them, I kind of wonder sometimes nowadays if it isn't, I'm not a gamer, but if it isn't what gamers are like, because you take on the world from so many different perspectives. So those things made a big difference for me in terms of the way I saw the world. And then, of course, writing letters to my friends and notes to my friends about what the world looked like helped me to learn to frame it. But I want to throw something else here in that I think we probably would also all agree on, but we haven't mentioned, and that's music. Because while the books were my lifeblood, it was actually music in the 1960s and the 1970s that made me recognize the extraordinary power of words, as well as the music that went with them, but especially words, to open up sort of the extraordinary textures of other experiences. And I can remember lying on a bed in the farmhouse, listening actually to Jackson Browne's Late for the Sky, that CD. I mean, no, it wasn't a CD, it was an album in those days, again and again, and sort of trying to imagine what California might look like, and what evening in California might look like. And of course, not having the tools to actually see that, but to recognize that there was an entire world out there and that I could get access to it from where I was through music and books and art. And that, I think, is one of the themes probably that brings us all here tonight.
Oh yeah, I would agree with that totally. I mean, growing up listening to the music of the 60s, late 60s and the 70s when I became really aware of it, and to think about how political it was at that time, and people talking about the very things that I was interested in, things that I was living, as I mentioned before, about integrating the schools, all of those kinds of things. It was very deeply influential to me. And I should also say, and I should have said before, the first real influence on me was my mother, who read to me all the time, you know, reading before bed. And it was clear to me that my parents thought that books and reading, those things were important. And we had books in the house, and I used to read them, things that I was probably, you know, too young to be reading and not really understanding, but that was always a feature there. And so that combined with the substance of the books, the act of reading, but also music and lyrics, the kinds of things that people were talking about during that time period were definitely influential. When I was small, my mother gave me a radio, and at night at 6 o'clock, KILT, which was the big radio station in Houston, the signal went out, and then I could hear WLS in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And radio stations all over the country, and to hear people hear the songs that they played there versus the ones they played. A lot of it was similar, but it opened up a whole world to me, and that living in your head in a way, that radio and those songs helped, along with the reading, I think definitely had an influence on me.
In our generation, I do think that was an enormous influence, and it's right that both of you bring that out. And it ranged from the blues to child ballads to the latest rock songs. I remember in high school, we'd tell my parents we were going to go hear a percussion and string ensemble, which meant we were going to go hear Buddy Guy or Tom Rush over at Club 47 in Cambridge. It was very special.
You know, it's interesting how we all get to where we are from such different places and yet have some of the same understandings. And I don't believe we had any books in my home, not because my parents didn't value education, because they certainly did, and they made it clear to us that education was really important, but they didn't have much of a formal education. And so they never read stories to us. Or read books to us, but they did tell us stories and tongue twisters and you know, little rhymes and so on. So and music also. I want to say something about music, because for us it was growing up with Spanish music always, salsa and some of the old ballads and so on. And when I was a teenager, so this was in the 50s and late 50s, 60s. And, you know, we used to listen to, mostly my sister and I would listen to rock and roll. And so we usually had a New Year's party at home because our home was sort of the place where the whole family came, the extended family, all the cousins, aunts and uncles who had, actually most had been brought over by my father from Puerto Rico. And there was the rival of the turntable. You know, we would put on rock and roll, and they would put on the Spanish ballads, Spanish language ballads from the Caribbean, from Latin America, and so on. And it wasn't until later that I really got to appreciate Spanish music. And that's the majority of what I listen to now. It's so interesting because as a teenager, you're sort of rebelling, especially because the only image that you've gotten that's a positive image of your own background has come from the family, but not from the outside world. You know, we never read anything about people who were like us. We never saw any images in the books or even in school. And so we learned very early on that it was not cool to be Puerto Rican. I'm really glad that, you know, life has disabused me of that feeling, and that I learned otherwise. But this is why, you know, this is what brought me into the field that I'm in, that I feel like all kids need to be reinforced in who they are. And as I said before, to learn about everything else that they can learn about, of people who are unlike them, so that they can develop some kind of not only collegiality, but solidarity and compassion for others whose lives are quite different from their own.
We live in this time where you as a teenager don't have to necessarily wait for the show to come on the radio. You can access, series of music. But that identification with the words and with the sound is in some sense still this solitary first step, I think, towards identity, but also in a way to be a humanist, to be someone who finds in words a context that you relate to, even if it's emerging from another part of the country. And so I do think you are really hitting on something as far as the humanities and music, really as an early entry point for all of us, because in the end, we are sort of setting aside time for ourselves to really engage with a piece of art and think about what it means to us. And seems to be, to me, where you get hooked.
Well, if you think about the pandemic, certainly brought this out. All the kinds of things that people do, or they did. People played music, people wrote books, people read. You turn to the humanities in this moment of, I was here in Manhattan and going out to the park for a walk and seeing the tents of the people, of the overflow from the hospital that had been set up in parts of the park. And this feeling of being under siege, what you wanted to do was turn to the arts, turn to some form of the arts, the humanities, to get us through all of that. And that's something we take it for granted, how much we rely on it. And then you have this moment of crisis, and naturally it just comes back to you as this is a comfort. This is something that will help me get through this.
What are some things you were listening to or turning to specifically? Because I would love to get recommendations from all of you as we continue to sustain through this crisis. But for you, Annette, what were the things that you look back over the last 18 months and think that piece meant a lot to me in getting through?
Well, I had taken up the piano again after taking it from 5 to 12, and then I stopped, just abruptly, just stopped. And this was before the pandemic, but I started taking piano lessons again. So I continued with that with my teacher every week, and then every other week. And then I wrote on Juneteenth during the pandemic. So it was writing and reading. Those, I turn back to the thing that brings me a lot of comfort, and that's writing. And so that's how I got through this, really.
John, any recommendations?
Well, two, but I'll begin with the one that might be surprising for its commonplaceness. For years, there'd been 3 Book of the Month Club copies of Ernest Hemingway novels on the shelf, sitting in the house where everyone converged. And I'd always carefully avoided them for a variety of reasons. And saw
Despite
this
your beard.
Despite my beard, exactly. And I saw this movie called Midnight in Paris, where there's this little vignette. Some actor plays Hemingway for 3 minutes or something. And it was just such a great performance. I said, I'll read the For Whom the Bell Tolls. And I just decided I would. And it really turned out to be a much broader and deeper experience than I expected. Hemingway is in many ways a great writer. He is Hemingway. You get those aspects of it in there as well. But capturing the whole impact of the Spanish Civil War, something I didn't know a great deal about, the quandaries, which side you were fighting on, how you were fighting, what you believed. I found very, very moving, and also so far away from this nice rural place where we were all under shelter that it proved to be a great book from my standpoint to read, even in those circumstances. And it led to reading a book called Spain in Our Hearts by the person who wrote King Leopold's Ghost, about reactions in the US to the Spanish Civil War and people joining the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and the terror exercised by the right, but also the kind of theological and bloody battles the left, the Trotskyites and the Stalinites and the anarchists were fighting. And it's a reminder of the challenges to civil society, just how different directions can attack a sense of community and make people comfortable doing horrible things to each other. So it unfortunately resonated with that as well. But I guess I'll conclude, because as I kept reading, it's interesting in the final element, it's not a happy ending, but Spain's a more stable society now than it was in those days. It is a democracy. If you're Catalan, you might have a different view on it, but it is, there is room to build a society that's better than the one that Hemingway was describing at the beginning. So that was quite a journey, and it was one that helped carry me through COVID. And Sonia, I'll note, speaking of happy endings, I was deeply gratified to see that the Spanish National Railroads helped you and your husband meet. So, there was
Yes.
clearly several positive benefits to eventual peace.
That's right. Yeah, I was going to say, I met my husband on the train. And as I wrote in my memoir, we were assigned the same seat on the train. I was 22, he was 25. We fell in love immediately. And, the rest is history, 54 years later. But thank you for giving those two. I've never read For Whom the Bell Tolls. And so I've been meaning to read it for a long time, but I've never heard of Spain in Our Hearts. My husband was, he said that when he was a kid, walking down the street, he would be assailed by shouts of "Hijo de Rojos," son of Reds, and that the government, which were the rebels, which was the Franco party, had taken all the furniture from his house, for example, and they were, so his family was sort of on the outskirts of society. And they lived through many difficult years, but I've learned a great deal. I've even kept in touch with a friend whose uncle was in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So, it really, there's nothing like reading about people who are different from you, who have different experiences, to really expand your world. I mean, that has certainly happened to me, and I'm very grateful for it.
I want to stay on a hopeful note, but also ask, I think, an important question for the four of you, which is, as we look at the deep challenges we face as a country and as a world, and as people who both teach and study and certainly reflect on these things, what role do you see the humanities playing in the coming years in a positive way? And what are the challenges for the humanities given the context in which we all work today? I'll start with you, Heather.
Well, I think that that we've all, but maybe particularly Annette, put our fingers on the fact that with the pandemic, people have turned to the humanities, and that's one thing I have really seen in the letters I get and in the contact I've had with people across the country who are reaching back not only for their history, but also for their art, amazing paintings and photographers and fabric artists and sculptors and graphic designers and people who are sort of saying, this is what really matters. And this is what bridges are, the differences between different groups of people. So that is an element of hope. But the thing that interests me right now in terms of the humanities and in terms of what mass humanities does, as opposed to sort of more generally how humanities can rebuild a shattered society, is that especially because people were stuck at home, not able to go to their jobs, and distanced from their family members whom they connected with over Zoom through cooking or whatever, I wonder about how our country in the future might do the sort of things that mass humanities is doing, going ahead and reaching out in a continuing ed level or to people who are no longer in the K through 12 or K through 16 group to learn history, for example. And the idea of permeating our society more fully with the humanities that have been perhaps neglected in the last 40 years in America at a national level seems to me like this is a moment that could happen, and to my mind should happen. So I have hope both for the country, but also for the future of humanities, so long as we don't say, oh, okay, now we had that 2-year interlude, we're going back to the way things have been since the 1980s.
And we were talking at the beginning about everyone's individual experiences teaching using Zoom and the advantages and disadvantages. And I do think, Heather, that comment about how do you broaden exposure to literature, to music, sea shanties certainly enjoyed a boom during the pandemic, and to literature, using alternative means of communication, exploiting in a positive way the internet to share knowledge and build community in the humanities will be, and I know, Brian, that's something you think about, and everyone at Mass Humanities, I think will be part of the challenge going forward.
It holds
You know,
out
I'm
great hope. I
generally-
mean, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I'm generally a hopeful person, a very hopeful person, but I have to say that at the same time that I'm hopeful that we've learned something through the pandemic, I'm also concerned when I see how social media has been used, for example, to create this uproar over critical race theory, for example, and, you know, haranguing people and you know, chasing them out of meetings and it's and saying stuff that is just so, you know, uninformed, not only about things like critical race theory, but also about the vaccination. And I think it really is very concerning for me as an educator, what this means for our future, of how we can, you know, be so incredibly divided, which we are, of how we can be, you know, not listening to one another, not learning from one another. So while I'm a hopeful person, these things have given me pause.
I feel the same way. And as a person who writes about the early American Republic, thinking about what's going on now in our political system and about the future of the Republic, this is not, I don't think this is a joke. This is this is a moment of truth for us. And I'm like you, Sonia, I'm not entirely convinced that the people who, the media or people who have, you know, have the responsibility for talking about this really are getting it. They're just sort of assuming that because it's the United States of America, of course it's going to be fine. That's not a given, you know, it isn't a given. I am hopeful about the internet in the sense that one of the things the pandemic has shown us is I've done events that would have, if I had done them in person, there would have been, you know, 50 or 60 people there, and there are a couple of hundred people because people can come. I have gone to workshops. I have done things, you know, for colleagues that I would never have been able to, you know, to talk about their manuscripts that I would never have been able to do. I wouldn't be able to drop in on that if I had to get on a plane and go there. So lots of ways of getting together have been made much easier, but at the same time, there's this, it's a double-edged sword. On the other hand, it's allowed for a lot of disinformation. It's allowed for a lot of divisiveness, all kinds of things to spread in a way that's been detrimental or threatens our whole system here. So I'm optimistic about the good things, but I see problems on the horizon that I don't think that we're necessarily rising to the occasion on.
I think the irony of this time is that we've never had so many technologies to connect us and yet never been so divided. Even at a personal family level, we're seeing divisions over things, whether it's politics or vaccines, and obviously there's overlap between the two. I do think that gets back to this need to have some sense of the past and an ability to connect to those things, to at least, if nothing else, have something to talk about and argue about that perhaps we can find our way on. And I think that's work that you all have been working on for quite a long time.
Well, there is also, I would suggest, though, there's a difference between what we are seeing, which is, what we see in real civil discourse, disagreements, and disinformation. And it does seem to me that the disinformation that we have suffered under, not just for the last 5 years, but before that, reaching quite a ways back, that as a civil society informed by the humanities, we need to figure out how to put walls around that. Yeah. If in fact you believe that reasoned discourse leads to good outcomes, as I do, what you need to do is figure out a way to extract from reasoned discourse the disinformation that is flooding us and creating these ridiculous situations that we've already identified here, which are not differences of opinion, they're flat out lies. And that, that goes to the American law and our history. How do you put those things together to go ahead and strip that out of our conversations? And one of the things that the internet has done is given people a much broader reach, both for the good, but also for the bad. But it does seem to me that with the will, we could figure out how to handle that, how to handle the disinformation. But I think as we've identified, we're not entirely convinced that our current lawmakers are interested in addressing that disinformation. And that's where the humanities come in again and say, come on, people, if you really care about humanity and about democracy, it's time to put your oar in the water.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great challenges for humanities today. And as you say, Heather, both in terms of law and tradition, disagreement, and even very strenuous disagreement, is integral to what we're about. But the premise or basing arguments on lies is simply unacceptable and is one of the great challenges for the humanities community. But Annette, I'll just quickly say, in terms of your noting reaching out to larger groups, I was able to hear you speaking about Juneteenth, and it is the kind of thing where I probably couldn't have done it that day to be able to hear it. And those kind of stories, which have an element of community and an element, a local element, and a broader story of how communities deal with challenges, can be very inspiring. And the Zoom is a way to do it. I went to Texas 35 years ago just to wander around, and went to Houston, and it was Juneteenth, and from Boston, like, what is Juneteenth? I had no idea what it was and had a chance to learn then. I knew even then Texas had strong and sometimes idiosyncratic traditions, but I was delighted to learn about that one. And hearing it over Zoom, again, is the kind of thing that I think humanities organizations can do to reach out with local stories that matter.
I think the local is a good place to continue to work. And for mass humanities, that has been, the impact we've tried to make. And especially during a pandemic, when people are not able to travel and where your circle is much smaller, I think we have hope that by really allowing the reckoning from history to play out at a local level, where people are able to understand, as in Annette's work, but it also in the work that small museums and historical societies do, what the conflicts have been that have led to the place in which you now live. That seems to be a place to begin, and certainly a place that we're comfortable in. We're getting close to our close here, so I wanted to ask a local question, which I always like to ask as I just continue to get to know Massachusetts and the region. I would love to know something about the town that you live in, something you like about it, or something that connects to perhaps a larger story, because I think that is so much of the work of the humanities, as we were talking about with music, is seeing your situation as part of a larger story. I'll start with you, Sonia.
So we have lived in Massachusetts for 46 years. And, I always say that aside from marrying my husband, it was the best decision we've ever made. And we're very happy about it and very happy living here with all its contradictions. And Amherst is a particularly interesting place, for those who don't know it. There's a saying that Amherst, where only the H is silent. And so talk about civil discourse, sometimes not so civil, but everybody has a say. And, that's a good thing most of the time. Sometimes you get a little tired of it, but I think it's a great place to live because, all of that is happening all the time. I've learned a lot since we've lived here, not only about Amherst and about the history of Amherst, but also about many other things. Now, in terms of Amherst, for example, that it was named after Jeffrey Amherst. And we had a hotel that was called the Jeffrey Amherst Hotel or Motel or Inn. It was the Inn. And because of student protests and then supported by Amherst College, although Amherst College hasn't changed its name, but the inn is no longer the Jeffrey Amherst Inn because of the treatment of Native people by Jeffrey Amherst. That's a whole other story that I never would have found out about. So, that's what I would say. I've met many, many people of different backgrounds here, and that's been a joy. And I've really, benefited from our living here. And of course, my time at the university, both as a doctoral student and later as a faculty member for many years.
John, you had warned us earlier that there was a jackhammer outside of your home on Beacon Hill, which tells us there's progress afoot on Beacon Hill, and that's always a good thing. Can you tell us a little bit about the neighborhood?
Yeah, they may have been eliminating some lead pipes, which would be gratifying to me personally. I'm willing to bear the sacrifice. It's interesting because one thing, and maybe this was again a pandemic thing, is I began to think a little bit about the city as a physical entity, and that actually created some additional perspectives. I hadn't really focused, but it's true that Boston's largely landfill. It was a lot smaller in the 18th century than it is now. And there's an MIT book that lets you take walks where Boston actually was in 1800. And it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's some virtue to take an arbitrary walk. It just takes you to places that you're not going for business, you're not going as a tourist. You see all sorts of elements of the city. Inequality in the city is brought home dramatically when you just steer a course through a neighborhood and get to see what folks are doing and go to places you wouldn't automatically go to. And you get a different sense of the dimensions of the city socially and culturally and economically that I hadn't expected when I started to take that walk. The other thing it reminded me is that a lot of Boston is very low. And it's the challenge that we haven't spoken about today, but the challenge of rising sea level and global warming, at least in the community I live in, could in 100 years have a profoundly transformative impact. In a place like East Boston, which is enormously exposed to it, comes home when you actually go over and take a walk around.
That will have an impact on Amherst as well, and everywhere. So I think that change is one that unfortunately is coming. Annette, we know that you're in Manhattan, so it falls on you to make the Boston-New York comparison here. Tell us a little bit about Columbus Avenue.
To make I live in two places. I live in Cambridge part of the week and in New York and the other part of the week.
Only Cambridge then.
Only Cambridge. Cambridge is a special place. It has the reputation of the People's Republic of Cambridge, as they call it. I love coming there. Being in Manhattan it's there's an energy level that's unmatched, and it's nice to come to Cambridge, which is not a small town, but it has a small town feel to it after Manhattan, and to be in a space with, tree-lined streets and young people, to be surrounded by so many students from Harvard and MIT and Lesley and other schools around. It's a vibrant place. I get a sense of new things happening all the time, and it's bewildering. I went to law school in Cambridge, and I didn't get to know the town until my daughter went to Harvard as an undergrad, and then I came there to teach afterwards. And streets that I didn't know existed, places I've never been, were just right around the corner. I spent most of my time in the law school in Langdale, Langdale Library and Gannett House, and not getting out very much, but it's a wonderful place. I went back one of the things that struck me, we have a pretty strong mask game here on the Upper West Side, but in Cambridge, it's even stronger, I would say. People fulfilling their civic responsibilities in a way that it doesn't seem to be taking place in my home state of Texas, certainly. I love it. The atmosphere just crackles with smart people, smart young people running around and enjoying one another and enjoying their school environment. When I went to Dartmouth, and we have a very, very strong study abroad program. Pretty much everybody, unless they're med students, goes overseas. And I was talking to a group of Harvard students about this, and because I think Harvard may make it a little bit more difficult to do that, to go overseas, and they want you to do it in the summer. And they both said, the group of people that I was with said, well, why would we want to be anywhere else right now? We're here at this point in our lives, and we want to be in Cambridge for these 4 years. Why we want to go other places when we could be here? And so I love the vibrancy of it. And didn't know how much I missed it until I went back and was walking around and said, yes, this is a place that I really, really enjoy. And it's certainly great being there as a professor, with being with your colleagues and so many different things to do. It's just every night I could be somewhere, and having Boston nearby too, with the schools in Boston as well. I could be someplace every night doing some interesting thing, some with the humanities or whatever, and that professors have access to. So I see it as just a very, very vibrant place.
I was in Cambridge on Tuesday night at Mount Auburn Cemetery for a play written by Patrick Gabridge about the abolitionists who are buried in the cemetery. Mm-hmm. And a few months ago at our Reading Frederick Douglass reading in Amherst, it was mentioned that we were standing in the footsteps of abolitionists and Ground Railroad by being in Amherst. And I do take inspiration, I think, for that history that Massachusetts has around struggles for equality. Mm-hmm. So I certainly hear that echo everywhere around the Commonwealth.
Mm-hmm. If I can,
yes, sure, go ahead.
I'm just going to interject just one final thing that I was remiss in not mentioning. I have been in and around Boston my entire life with a few interludes. And the one thing I should have said is that it is, I think, a better community than it was when I was a teenager. There are a million problems. There are many issues to be addressed, but Boston was a divided city in many profound ways. That division isn't completely gone, but it is very different. And the entire population, certainly I am the gainer for this city being more diverse and more open than it was when I was young.
I appreciate that. Heather, I read somewhere that you may be in Maine some of the time. Tell us a little bit about that.
But I am a Massachusetts resident, and I do that because I am a big fan of Massachusetts. But as you're talking about what it is about Massachusetts that is special, for me, it's the history. It's the history of everything overlaid in the Mount Auburn Cemetery, but along the seacoast, and about how Boston is filled in, and how you can actually stand there where Daniel Shays marched in from the west, and out there, and I don't even remember now where it is, but there's a church right near Amherst that has a rock wall that's made of slate. I've never seen anything like that anywhere else. But it's beautiful enough that I was just saying to my partner that, when we have time over the winter, I really want him to go see this, do this 2-hour drive to go see this slate rock wall right there by the place they filled in to make the reservoir there. And what always interests me about that is there is the history, of course, back to the indigenous people, overlaid with more and more layers and more stories, right up until you get to my own ancestors and my own family members and, my sisters, and on into my children, who do things like study the fact that Boston is really low and it's going to have a real problem if there's an earthquake because it's all landfill. So we have this history of this past, but the layers and layers of different meanings in different people that also include the present, and really powerfully, I think, the future, where Massachusetts has gone ahead and taken steps into the future in ways that many of our other states perhaps have not. And I find that juxtaposition of, oh yes, I'm in this cemetery at Cambridge and there's the skull with the wings on it, right next to cutting edge, schools of politics, for example. This incredibly vibrant and incredibly exciting, but also very well grounded, and it's a heady combination, and one that's a real joy to be part of.
It has been a joy to be with the four of you and to go through the layers of your own stories and your lives and the insights you have on where we may be heading. So I just really, on behalf of our board and our staff and all the folks watching tonight, want to thank you all for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Great.